We are in the Gospel of Mark. I am very excited about this because we are all the way in chapter 2 now. There's only 16 chapters, so don't be but we're making progress. And if you remember what happened last week, and again, we are looking at Mark's portrait of Jesus. Kind of Jesus through the eyes of a young man who was there sometimes in other stories he'd heard and given to us, and we can see by the details whether the author was there or not. But we've seen this progression. Jesus started healing, and what he wanted to do was teach, but what everybody wants him to do is to heal. And so he came back to Capernaum, where he's relocated from Nazareth. Remember the story last week? And he went into a house, and it was so crowded and packed, and it was packed with religious people. People came all the way from Jerusalem. These religious leaders came all the way down from all over Judea, and they were there to hear Jesus, and the paralytic's friends couldn't get in there. We looked at the story, and they ripped up the roof, and they brought the man before Jesus, and Jesus said, "Your sins are forgiven," and all the religious leaders went, and Jesus said, "So you know the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins," because in their mind, the man was probably paralyzed because of sin. That's not necessarily true, and I don't think Jesus believed that. But they did. And so he had him backed in a corner, and so he told him to get up and walk, and the man got up and walked. And now Jesus has made some real good enemies for doing that. Yeah. Now here's how it works. And these are religious people, okay? And you're going to hear me say things about religious people, and I need to define this because these aren't spiritual people. You can be religious and not be spiritual. Religious means you just do things over and over and over again the same way. Right? Being spiritual is a whole different story, where you feel love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control. That's the big difference. But the religious people, and they were in the right religion. They were studying the Old Testament, right? These guys were, you'll hear them talk about teachers of the law. These are professors of the law. And they're there to determine whether Jesus is okay or not. But now Jesus has made them nervous with this idea of him having authority that he can forgive sins. So what did they do? Well, they start picking around the corners. And that's what we're going to see in the story today in Mark chapter 2 and verse 13. So you can read along with me up here. In verse 13 it says, "Once again Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' Jesus told them, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed Jesus. And when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, 'Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?' And on hearing this, Jesus said to them, 'It's not the healthy you need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners.'" Okay, this is one of the stories we're going to look at this morning, and I need to give you some background on this story because there's so much packed into this thing. It went on during that time. Jesus is walking along, there's a crowd following him, and he comes across a tax collector. We have any tax collectors in here? I had to be careful because the church I worked with in Jacksonville, a guy worked for the IRS. So I had to be sure to distinguish them. But this was a tax collector, and his name was Levi, and his dad's name was Alphaeus. And that's a lot of detail to know about this guy. Right? And by the way, he goes by a different name. You know what his different name is? Matthew. Matthew. You know the book in front of the one we're studying now? Yeah. Written by, Matthew, Levi, son of Alphaeus. And we know his profession. We know about Peter and Andrew and James and John. We know they were fishermen. But Jesus called this guy specifically, and he was a tax collector. How do you feel about tax collectors? Well, wait. Let's not make it. How do you feel about taxes? Yeah. I mean, I found out here that you can go to a Target in Glendale and be taxed different than a Target in Surprise. And sometimes it makes a decision about which one you're going to go to, right? Taxes. That necessary evil, but it was a whole different world back then. Let me tell you how this worked. These are Roman taxes. And here's how Roman taxes worked. Those people way off in a town called Rome in Italy, who dressed in these weird togas that were purple borders, and they sat in the Senate, and they decided that this year we needed so many, and they call them talents, huge amounts of gold to make this thing work. So we needed 100 million talents. And I made that number up because that used to sound like a lot. Does it sound like a lot anymore? Okay, 100 billion talents. It's hard to get a feeling for this idea. And so what they do is they decided this province needs to come up with a certain percentage of that. And this province needs to come up with a certain percentage of that. And so they would tell the people in the area that we call Palestine, okay? And they'd say, your responsibility is 45 million talents. And so the governor would go, I got to collect 45 million talents. And so what they would do is they would hire people to collect taxes. Now, they didn't have cash registers back then. So it was not like you could pay for it with a cash register. What they would do is get you on the road. Because you would be carrying materials from here to there. And they would stop you and say, I think that's worth 500 talents. Or what? That's ridiculous. They would have to get something much, much smaller, right? But you know how they paid those people? They didn't pay them. What they said is, your job is to get 100,000 talents. So, if they got 150,000 talents, who got to keep the 50,000? Yeah. The tax collector. And so these things weren't worked out. These weren't in pages of the tax law. These were just purely whimsical. He would look at your wagon and said, that's going to be $100. The next day he'd look at your wagon and say, that's going to be $200. And there's no way you could say that's not fair. Was it fair? No. It's not fair. And you know where that money went? Well, the one that didn't go into his pocket went to Rome. And how did you feel about that? You hated that. You know, the closest thing I ever had to this is when people would send me packages when I was in Ghana, in West Africa. And the ones that would make it through and come all the way to my little post office were okay. They didn't charge me anything on that. But the ones that got stopped in the capital of the province I was in, I would have to go and pay some kind of import tax on that. And it was purely whimsical. They would open it up and say, 20 Ghana. And say, wait a minute, it's not worth that much. But there's nothing you could do. If you wanted it, you had to give them. And you never knew if that went into the cash register or if it went right into that person's pocket. You didn't know. And you know what? It felt unfair. You know where I hated to go? It was into that office. And I try to smile and I try to be nice. But I know this isn't fair. So, why do I tell you that? Guess who their least favorite person was in town? The tax collector. And how do we know that? Well, look at the two categories we came up with. There's sinners, and then there's tax collectors. Well, sinners are bad enough, right? I mean, who are you going to throw in there? Murderers, thieves, rapists, and then there's tax collectors. Guess who Jesus chooses to be one of his apostles? A tax collector. We have another story of a tax collector. And remember the little guy that climbed up the sycamore tree? Remember that? He was a short guy and he climbed up there. And, we're not talking about this story. Forget that one. We're talking about this tax collector. And here's what this tax collector did. He followed Jesus. He got up from his booth and he followed Jesus. And then he invited Jesus over to his house. Oh boy. And Jesus went. He went to Matthew's house. And guess who Matthew's only friends were? Other tax collectors. Nobody else really thought that highly of them. So they kind of stuck together, right? And so Jesus is in this house with his disciples, his followers, and he's having this feast with other tax collectors and sinners. Right. So guess what the religious people are going to do? Oh, wait a minute. Don't you know who you're eating with? Did Jesus know who he was eating with? Yeah. Yeah, he knew. He chose to go. Didn't he? But that bugs the religious leaders. Now the Pharisees and teachers of the law. He says there were some teachers of the law who were Pharisees. And this is a special clique. And we're not sure exactly what Pharisee means, but it appears to mean some form of separatist. Being separate. Being away from everybody else. And in the next story, we're going to see John the Baptist's disciples. The ones who are following John the Baptist. And John looked suspiciously like the group of Essenes in this area. And you know the word Essenes means separatist. That they are different from everybody else. They are separate from everybody else. They are better. They're better. They follow the law better. God's happier with them. We get that way, don't we? We kind of get that into the us and them thing. We're better. We're just a little better. We're better than this group. You know why there's so many churches? Because some churches are better. Every church is better, isn't it? The people there, they're better. They're just a little bit better. They do things a little bit more biblically. Or they do things a little bit more spiritually. Or they do whatever they do, and they can say, compared to everybody else, and they do like to compare themselves to everybody else, they say, we are better. And we invite our friends to church. We talk about the good things at our church, and we hope that our church is better. What a strange, strange thing. So they have trouble with Jesus. Why does your master eat with tax collectors and sinners? Do you know who they're not talking to? They didn't come to Jesus They came to his disciples and said, "Why does your master do that? Shouldn't you quit following him? Maybe follow us? Because this tax collector thing is bad. It's really bad." And the text says when Jesus found out about that, they weren't talking to him, so he had to find out about it from one of his disciples saying, "Hey, this is what the teachers of the law are asking me. Why am I hanging out with you if you're hanging out with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus said, I'm going to go answer them directly. He said, it's not the healthy that need a doctor. It's the sick. I haven't come to call the righteous, but the unrighteous. Now, there's a little part of us that says, okay, Jesus is giving them a pass. He's saying, you guys are righteous and so you don't need me. Let go of that. Jesus' biggest problem, and the focus of most of his teaching that we have, like the Sermon on the Mount, is against these guys. And by the end, not even the end, the middle of next chapter, chapter 3, they're going to be plotting to kill Jesus. Yeah, we don't even get past chapter 3, and they've already decided Jesus has to die. So, he's not giving them a pass. If you know you are unhealthy, you go to the doctor, right? It's the people who don't think they're unhealthy that don't go to get help. If you don't think you need Jesus, if you don't think you need the sacrifice that Jesus made, you won't come to remember it, and it won't mean anything to you. It's not the healthy. And it's the people who are in touch with their sinful nature. It's the people who know that the more I know about Jesus, the more I realize how much I am not like God. They're the ones who come, who remember, who are grateful, who are happy in Jesus. So, this is just the beginning. Let's see what happens next. It says here in verse 18, now John's disciples, we know John's Jesus' cousin, and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so as long as they have him with them. But a time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wineskins. Okay, let's try to take this one apart. Let's start with fasting. Fasting. Fasting means not eating, right? Skipping meals. This is a great religious thing to do. It is. You can fast. And you can show God how serious you are by how much you fast. Right? Or how long you fast. This has gone on way, way back. In the Old Testament, you'll hear not so much talking about fasting as humbling themselves before God. When they would humble themselves with sackcloth and ashes, and they would go without eating. But by this time, it's become a certain thing. And guess what? We know how many times the Pharisees fasted. Twice a week. He's going to talk about that. Twice a week. Why they're fasting at this point? I don't know. Well, John's disciples are fasting. Maybe it has to do with them being fed up with Roman occupation. Or maybe they're upset with Herod, who was a puppet of Rome. We don't know. All we know is they had called a fast. And guess who wasn't going to fast? Jesus. And that bugged him. That bugged him. How do we get Jesus' disciples to fast? Well, why do you fast? There's an excellent passage in Isaiah about this. I probably shouldn't put it up on the board, but I didn't know how much time we would have. So it has to do, in Isaiah chapter 58, he says, what you're doing is not what I want you to do. They were fasting. They said, how come you haven't heard us? We've humbled ourselves. We fasted. And Jesus says, you really call this a fast? You just go without eating and you still oppress the poor? You still mistreat foreigners in your land? He said, do you think that's what I want? He said, here's the fast that I want. Break the chains of oppression. Feed and take care of your neighbors, the people I care about. Wow. I'm going to tell you some things about biblical fasting, and it may not sit well with you to begin with, but I want you to think about it for a second, okay? You fast when you're not hungry. That's pretty easy. Let me give you an example of this. You know, I get a chance to go visit people in the hospital in situations with accidents and people who've gone through heart episodes and things like that, and the family is there, and they are intently in tune with what's going on, and they're concerned about it. And you know what I like to ask them? When was the last time you ate? And they say, oh yeah, we had breakfast yesterday, I think. Why were they not eating? Because they were so intent on the person that they loved, they weren't hungry. I would encourage you to go down to the cafeteria and eat. Because you can only go so long without food before you start to eat. That's the idea of a biblical fast, where you are so concerned about something, just concerned about oppression or some lack of justice or something, and you forget to eat. Is that what the Pharisees and John's disciples were doing? Here's what Jesus says you don't do. You don't tell everybody you're fasting. Do you remember that teaching? Mm-hmm. About the Pharisees that would go into the temple and they would disfigure their face and they would rumple their clothes. And people say, are you okay? Oh, I haven't eaten for 2 days. And you know what Jesus said? They just earned their reward. That's what they wanted. They wanted your attention. They wanted you to say, oh, wow, really? I've told you some things about the college group that I was part of. And all of us have probably gone through some religious groups that get into religious things. And the thing about religious things is you can compare and contrast them. Okay? This is the problem with religious things. Right? How many times did you go to church this week? Once? Was that all? Wow, we go twice on Sunday. We come back on Wednesday night. Wow. Who's more spiritual? Yeah. You fast this week? Yeah, I missed a couple meals and just a couple meals. I fasted for 3 days this week. Oh, wow. Aren't you a superbly superior religious person? And you know what? They got the reward, didn't they? What they wanted was for you to know. So you could think highly of them so you could compare what you do with them. And that always seems to come out this way, doesn't it? When people want you to compare to them, it's usually because they know they're going to come out on top. So this is doing a spiritual thing in a manward direction, not a Godward direction. So they want to know, why don't your disciples fast? You know, every time we see Jesus, he's at a party, at a house of a tax collector. That's just wrong. Right? That's wrong. And he shouldn't be having fun. And he most certainly shouldn't be joking. And he certainly shouldn't enjoy the wine. Why? Because we know what God wants. He wants us to be miserable. This is God in flesh. Right? This is God who's taken flesh. And he's at a party at a tax collector's house. And the religious people hate this. And they don't know, why can't you guys be miserable like us? And Jesus says, the bridegroom is with them. The bridegroom. This is the biggest parties they have, folks. This is not like our weddings. I mean, they went on for weeks. And they were celebrations. And the bridegroom and the bride didn't go away for their honeymoon. They stayed there. And everybody celebrated with them. Remember when Jesus' mother was in charge of the one in the Gospel of John? You remember what happened? They ran out of wine. So what did Jesus do? He made grape juice. No. He made wine out of water. Okay. Jesus uses this analogy. He said the bridegroom is still here. They are not going to fast. There's going to come a time when the bridegroom leaves, and at that point they'll fast. This is a fascinating passage, folks. Just, you got to mark this in your Bible. Do you ever wonder where Lent comes from? Do you ever wonder that? Remember the 40 days before Easter, and people, man, they used to do all kinds of different strange things. What they call it fasting, or they might give up something like coffee or chocolate or whatever, and you wonder why. Where does that come from? I haven't seen it in the text. This is it. This is it. It was from this passage when Jesus said, when the bridegroom's taken away from them, they'll fast. And so they, in the early church, used to have a 3-day fast. And then there was a debate about whether it should be 4 days. And that debate ran out. And in the Middle Ages, it got transcribed somehow into 40 days. And that's where you got Lent. Yeah. It's right there. See it? Interesting what we do as religious people, isn't it? Interesting. But if you're doing things for other people to see, you've already received your reward. If your relationship is with Jesus, and you care about what he cares about, you love who he loves, you forgive who he forgives, you accept who Jesus accepts, yeah, that's what it means to follow the Spirit. Paul talks about in Galatians chapter 5, actually the end of chapter 5 and beginning of 6, and someday we'll get there, and I'm not sure exactly when, but we hope to get there. But he talks about you who are spiritual. And he just gave them that definition. Those who have love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control. You who are spiritual should go and help that person who is trapped, but you do it gently because you know you can get trapped too. See, a spiritual person knows that they still have a sinful nature, that they still need that forgiveness. Always. Always. And they'll never look at somebody and say, oh, come on. Because, they have the same nature. It's possible to do the same things also. Why doesn't Jesus' disciples, why don't they fast? Why don't they fast? Well, because they're with Jesus. They're happy. The bridegroom is with them. We sang a song, Trust and Obey. The only way to be happy in Jesus is to trust. The trust that He has taken care of everything you needed Him to take care of. You are forgiven. You are accepted. You are loved. And to obey. To forgive. To accept. To love. And every Sunday as disciples, we come and we reattach ourselves. We remember. We become member again. Remembering that Jesus loved us so much. That He came in the flesh and He sacrificed Himself. And we take a little bit of bread and we remember the body of Jesus. And we take a little bit of juice and we remember the blood of Jesus. And we remember to care about what Jesus cares about.